All right, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed panelists and distinguished guests, it's a pleasure to welcome you today on behalf of the Bertelsmann Stiftung, the Radical Exchange Foundation, and the University of Sciences Po. As we navigate the complexities of our digital age, concerns about the disruptive effects of technology on global governance are rising. Yet, our gathering today is anchored in a profound optimism, the belief that technology, if governed ethically, holds the potential to fortify our democracies. Moreover, it could even help reboot multilateral cooperation by generating buy-in from citizens, because this entire conversation today is about people and how we put them back at the center. Taiwan, a beacon of innovation, is at the forefront of this evolution. Taiwan has exemplified and put into practice how agile technology can advance democracy, pluralism, and citizen well-being. It provides a compelling model for the world. Central to our discussions today is also the concept of plurality, which offers a robust while young framework to understand and maximize the benefits of technological progress in our societies. This year, marked by critical elections around the globe, presents us with an opportune moment to reflect on the state of democracy. Indeed, we face essential questions. How can citizens exercise agency in shaping the future of tech? What kind of new tech and governance architectures facilitate and give legs to international cooperation? How can local and meaningful democratic experiences inspire and potentially unlock global cooperation when it might be stuck? These questions can lead to key opportunities, and we are privileged to have with us today an exceptional lineup of speakers who bring diverse perspectives and profound expertise. Audrey Tang, Taiwan's first digital minister, known for pioneering digital democracy initiatives, one of the greatest computing personalities of the world. Arantxa Gonzalez,
First time I heard that.
the Dean. Arantxa Gonzalez, the Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain, who has been navigating global governance at the highest level and who is hosting us today. Glenn Weil, the co-founder of Radical Exchange, but also of the Plurality Institute, and the co-author of a new book that has just been released, Plurality, the Future of Collaborative Technology and Democracy. And I believe there's some copies of the book outside that you will have the opportunity to get from Glenn, who is right here. And last but not least, Marie-Doa Besancenot, NATO Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy, who bridges technology and international relations in a critical security context today. And since today's event is about pluralism and collaboration, you will also be invited to contribute. You've all received a link to Poll IS, a conversation where you can express your own ideas, you can vote on other people's comments, experimenting a tool that has been deployed in Taiwan, Australia, Uruguay, and several UN organizations. Your inputs will structure the Q&A, so please join the conversation. Finally, our discussion will be enriched by a conclusion from Sergei Guriev, Provost of Sciences Po, and distinguished economist who has, among other topics, worked on populism online.
And who was my first microeconomics teacher in college.
There you go. We are thrilled to have these top experts with us today, especially as we build Sciences Po's PSIA new hub on technology innovation and international relations. Conceived with the mission of accelerating collaborative tech to address global challenges, connecting top leaders from different communities, and accelerating top governance projects is exactly at the heart of what we do. So thank you for joining. And now I turn to Martin Hewlin, Director of Digitization and the Common Good from the Bertelsmann Stiftung. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Constance. Thank you again to Sciences Po and also to Arantxa Gonzalez for hosting us, and also to the provost. Very excited to be here, actually with the privilege of moderating this very expert panel today. And I would like to kick off our discussion also with a question to you, Audrey, today, because for those of us who have been following the news to a certain extent, Taiwan has appeared again also very visibly in the international kind of circuit, for better or for worse. And the timing of your trip, for better and for worse, and the timing of your trip is a very, very thoughtful one, we find, and especially we find it very privileged to have the chance to discuss with you today. And of course, the question on our mind is, first and foremost, if out of your perspective you could tell us in a few words what you're observing in Taiwan at the moment, because I think we'd be very interested. And then after a few words at the beginning, I would then ask a few questions towards plurality.
Oh, sure. Yeah, this is my first week as not a digital minister for the past 7.5 years as serving as digital minister. And I still remember when I first entered the public service in 2014 as a advisor, a young reverse mentor to the previous cabinet. The approval rate was very interestingly at 9%. And after a couple years work in 2017-18, because of foreign information manipulation, in 2018, approval rate was below 20%. And so we had our share of foreign information manipulation, of polarization, of things like that. And so I think a lot of in the book, the plurality, is not starting from the point of Taiwanese people liking each other, but from a almost breaking schism and polarization that almost succeeded in tearing our democracy apart, and the kind of battle-tested frontline technologies that we deployed, so that, in a few words, in our January election, after the election, I think the effective polarization went to a historic low. The three major parties, none of which have a majority in the parliament now, they don't hate each other. And even now that the outgoing Tsai Ing-wen administration is on the second term, her approval rate was easily above 50%, which is unheard of in Taiwan after the 96 direct presidential election. So I think the mood is that Tsai Ing-wen, the administration, really did something right in bridging, but not brainwashing, in bridging, like making sure that the differences are respected, including but not limited to marriage equality, transitional justice, indigenous rights, and things like that. Before Tsai Ing-wen, we had just one national language, but now we have 20. And if you ask the indigenous people, they say that's macro language. We have actually 42. And so the diversity is now much more celebrated instead of being clamped down as in the martial law or even in the pre-Tsai Ing-wen days. And I think that is one of the legacy of the Tsai Ing-wen administration, and is something that she is now being remembered. I think that's a kind of brief overview of the work of the past 8 years.
Yeah, thank you very much. And maybe honing in a little bit on that as well. Are there any particular lessons that also stick out to you that other countries can learn in regards, of course, to the policy approach, but also the technological usage when it came to democratic also participation and involvement of the citizens?
Yeah, I mean, I was just at a Copenhagen Democracy Summit, well, virtually, but also the Summit for Democracy. And a lot of people, including journalists, are very interested in the grassroots collaborative fact-checking ecosystem, Kofax, but also Trend Micro, Google Look, this whole antivirus ecosystem turned into a disinformation preventing ecosystem with people's participation. But I think that is, of course, important, but the tech is not the most interesting bit. The most interesting bit is the civic text people's idea of pre-bunking, of participatory fact-checking, and so on, very quickly made its way into policy and indeed into curriculum. Starting 2019, we took out all the words literacy from our curriculum and replaced it with the word competence. So the students are not ranked on how much they remember or even critical thinking, but how much they can contribute to a collaborative fact-checking, because it is not the checked facts, it's not the nuggets of truth that protects the society from information attacks. It is the act of going through fact-checking, of thinking like a journalist, that inoculates a young mind, and through the young mind, the older minds in their family, against information and polarization attacks. And so I think the policy works in tandem with the technology, and it is the latency of a technological innovation happening, and then just within 2 months becoming a policy. That is actually the success story of Taiwan, but it's not very often told in international fora.
Thank you for this overview. And I would like to now lead over to you, Glenn, in this case, because you've been joining Audrey now on this road tour across Europe. I think you started in Madrid. You are now in Paris.
Starting in Europe and heading to many other places.
Yeah,
Exactly.
very much so. Yeah.
We came here because of the elections that are upcoming, and we'll go with many other elections. So.
Yeah, the timing is well chosen, that's for sure. I was wondering, because again, we want to go out today, out of this meeting also, being more, not literate, but having better competency when it comes to the notion of plurality as well. And I'd be very interested also in what actually was behind the inspiration when you embarked on further demystifying this notion of plurality and then also, writing the book together.
Well, there's a question of intention and there's a question of process, and they're not completely the same. So, I came in very excited about telling Audrey's story, something I remain deeply committed to in my life, and what ended up happening along the way was much more interesting than what I had imagined. First, we came in with the intention I was going to get an agent. This was going to be, a very classic book. In the end, we have no publisher. We have no agent. We have everything is owned and run and administered open source by the community, no
We're
copyrights.
still a bestseller on Amazon.
Yes, still a bestseller on Amazon. Audrey loves the Tao Te Ching. I've come to admire it very much myself, and in it, it talks a lot about the idea that the master is ready for anything and wastes nothing. And I think that's very much what I've learned along this way. There have been many, many challenges, and almost all of them have proved opportunities. This has become the first ever fully open source book, the first ever book with contributors from 5 continents that's written as like a book for a broad audience of people to read. It's also the first book in a quarter century endorsed by the Dalai Lama, because we took a proactive approach of seeking out diversity in the set of people that are participating in and part of the book. I think today was a very meaningful moment. Within 5 minutes of each other on X today, we had tweets, just spontaneous tweets, supporting the book from the first Quechua member of the Oscars, who's a neurodiverse VR artist living with indigenous people in Australia, from Johnny Moore, the top evangelical advisor to President Trump, from one of the leaders of the Aam Aadmi Party in India, who's an activist for religious pluralism, and from a member of the Macron group in the French Parliament. So that gives you a sense of the type of diversity that the book is bringing together.
Thank you so much, Glenn. And again, applauding also this effort of demystifying certain terms and also leveraging this force of the community at the end of the day and its diversity to bring these points across. But there's also another side, to an extent, also on this medal, where on one hand, one is demystifying, on the other hand, we have this risk of also disinformation and also risk to societal cohesion in many ways. And I would like to go over to Marie-Laure Besançon to also ask the question, again, from your vantage point at NATO and the really concrete risks also that we are currently facing as an alliance. What do you see there as entry points and also solution paths when it comes to the technological usage of this architecture that also has a plurality aspect to it?
Thank you very much. I'd like to say I've been working at NATO for 8 months, and this is my 4th time being on a panel with top Taiwanese experts. No, but I think it says a lot about our like-mindedness and our joint efforts, so I'm very happy. I relate a lot to everything that you said, and it's not a surprise. because our approach is based on risks, because NATO, of course, is a defense security organization, it's a political but also a military organization, which means that everything we do is pretty much dual-use minded, and the knowledge we get from the one side we try to leverage on the other side also. So this risk assessment is shared by allies, so it is a big exercise of collective thinking, I would say, permanent, happening in a very specific NATO democracy, which demands that every single ally share the same concern exactly. The smallest, just like the biggest nation, can veto everything at NATO, so there's a lot of value in that. So on the risk assessment, yes, disinformation is ranking very high. What do we do? I think NATO's DNA, and especially right now with the hot war happening in Europe, is deterrence, right? So NATO's ability to keep its technological edge is absolutely key to its deterrence capacities. So how do we do this? First of all, you leverage all the best capacities from allies, and they're very willing to share, and we try to raise each other's levels. So we have different committees dedicated to different topics, for example, one on resilience, for example, all sharing the best practices. On disinformation, it's very interesting because it's a more recent topic. It's included in the wider range of the hybrid threats topic, which we're all discovering and working a lot actually with Taiwanese partners, as with many others. And actually in Asia, I like to mention Japan. I mean, we really have a shared awareness of these threats. So what we do is provide platforms for this collective understanding of what's happening, the very systematic quality of these threats, and the responses that have worked somewhere could work elsewhere, and then create alert mechanism. Because usually when one nation, at least in Europe, one nation is attacked, the second one is probably hasn't noticed it yet, but probably is suffering the same kind of attack. So that's one thing we can do. The other thing we can do is invest ourselves in this technological edge. So NATO has two commands, military commands. One is operational command based in Brussels, and the other one is focused on transformation, and it's based in the US. And it's by nature completely future-looking. It's called Supreme Allied Command Transformation, SACT. That's all they do, is plan future threats, make sure that we invest in the right stuff, and make sure that it is right away by nature interoperable between the allies. So regarding disinformation, they've been advising for years now that we invest in different tools to monitor the information space, which I am now administrating in my division, so I'm very lucky to benefit from this forward thinking that's been going on in the past years, and now working with analysts to deliver this service both on the military side and the civilian side together, not duplicating our work, but focusing, each of us focusing on different areas of interest for their commands on their side, and for me, for my political leadership, so for political messaging. So very concretely, what kind of innovation? So we have an accelerator now in the UK based on startups leveraging AI mainly on hybrid threats. We have a huge network of 5,000 scientists across the 32 nations of the alliance, working on 300 different projects a year, most of them around AI also. And then we have an innovation fund that was just created 2 years ago, 1 billion euros for 15 years. Only 24 allies out of 32 are participating right now, but basically everyone is agreeing on the kind of technology that you see of great interest in the future. So yes, so both collective platform and investing directly.
Could I just respond to that for 1 second? I just would say, I think it's so phenomenal to learn about the work that you're doing, which I was not aware of. And it's exactly the sort of thing that in the policy chapter of the book 7-0, we call for. It's the sort of thing we need more of.
Great.
And I would really welcome you not just to keep doing and amplifying that work, but the book is open source. We'd love if your team would come in there and share the learnings from the work that you've done and lift up the wonderful work that you're doing so that it can be an example to others, and you all become co-authors of this project.
In the second edition.
In the second edition, which by the way, the second edition will probably be out in 1 month because we've set it up. Again, we talked about the problems, the opportunities. The opportunity of no publisher is that it takes us maybe 3 or 4 hours of work together to make a new edition.
We can make daily editions if we want.
But I have a question. If it's open source, it's still an edition or a version?
Well, it actually does take a little bit of work to get it like ready to literally be printed. So it's probably 6 hours of work for me and Audrey to turn a new edition. So we probably only do
There
that
is
once a month or
editorial work.
something.
We've not replaced that with our language models yet.
Yet. Wonderful. No, thank you so much for that perspective, and the invitation directly came.
It's
of
a
also
deal.
sharing.
Yeah.
There you
I'm willing
go.
to help.
Wonderful.
Well on the panel. But I would like also to then basically make the link now also to the educational side. And again, looking at you, Arantxa, because what Maridora just described in regards to the threat perspective and the resilience that's necessary, there's of course a technical angle to that of building this type of resilience, the connective tissue for collaboration. But there's a big also question in regards to the type of competency and educational programs that are necessary also that need to be designed to equip these future leaders and also give them the skills that are needed to navigate and implement these types of technologies and also understand what the shortcomings or the possibilities are. So I would be very interested also how Sciences Po and especially also the work that you're doing here is approaching this and also where international collaboration amongst academic structures comes into play.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us today. This is a home of social and human sciences, that at the end of the day is where all this has to land. All these schemes, technologies, programs, ideas, projects, resilience building has to land somewhere on people. And this is why it's all also about human and social sciences. So how do we see our role? We see our role as, first of all, understanding what motivates, how people react. I would be very eager, Audrey, to understand how you have driven the Taiwanese citizens to collaborate, and thus a space of pre-banking, for example. I know what motivates a plurality of actors to contribute to a publication. That's I can think of. But you know, at the end of the day, behind all of this, there is human beings. So our role has to be researching into what motivates, how people react, what not to do to get them not to react in the wrong way. We are also a convener, which is what we're doing today. We are connecting lots of different dots. We like to think that we can, in a world that is built on verticals, also on knowledge. You've got engineering schools, and then you've got mathematics, and then you've got physics, and then you've got literature and philosophy, and so on. We need places to connect all these different branches of science in a way. And this is something that we've cultivated for 150 years. Now we find ourselves recreating this space of multidisciplinarity in a new way with this new world of technology around us too. We are those that have to put doubts on the table. We have to put the questions, sometimes the uncomfortable questions. Well, what about ethics? What about winners? But what about also losers? How can we avoid concentration? How can we design in a way that leaves nobody behind? So we also have to be the place where all these questions are put and explored and exploited. Finally, we have to be also connectors. Connectors of the public with the private, with the not-for-profit. In this plurality of voices, I like a lot this word of plurality. We use it a lot here because this is what we have to do, be a plurality of voices. Sometimes bringing the plurality of voices is a very uncomfortable thing, I tell you. These days is pretty uncomfortable, but plurality is what gives you strength. So this is what is motivating us in Sciences Po to take this to the next level, to organize this also in terms of teaching. We've just opened a new mastery in technology and global affairs. It's a new area of work. We're doing this with a university in Madrid. This is why I know that you were in Madrid before. And basically what we want to do is look at international affairs from the optic of technology. Start with technology and understand how technology is shaping relationships of power, how it's shaping the economy, how it's shaping democracy, and how we have to govern. Next to it, we've built an extension. We call it a hub, where convening different parties, we will experiment. This is where NATO is experimenting with our students so that we understand what they need and our students can build the skills that in the end will build a bridge to the market. So a bit of a commercial, maybe if you wish, of what we are doing, how we are doing it, and why we are doing it, so that we connect the world of skills with the world of public, private, and not-for-profit, which at the end of the day is what you will all need. So you got brainy people to write brainy contributions to the new edition.
Great. And Arantxa, I just want to congratulate you, because I think the best advertisement of all is if people look around this room. This is a talk with technology in the title. You look at the people who are up on the stage, you look around this room. The people who are here are not the people who are in conversations about technology in most places, especially in the West. That is an incredible thing that you've already achieved, bringing in the diversity of people that I can just see in the room right now. And it's not with diversity in the title, it's not with whatever, it's by inviting people into a conversational space that speaks to the lived needs of people with a range of backgrounds rather than just people with a technical focus.
Yeah, I can only second that. And Arantxa, I wanted to pick out also one term that you've used, and that was the whole notion of interdisciplinary, also conversations, which goes to what Glenn was just saying of the silos also that we have. And it's very difficult to find individuals that actually cross those paths sometimes and are the interoperable kind of translators, not between languages, but also schools of thought, often, legal terminology amongst politicians, engineering expertise, or, so skill sets within the civil society. So Audrey, I want to come back also again to some of the experiences that you had when it came also to the public servants that were actually implementing also all of these very innovative policies at the end, but somewhere, the rubber has to hit the track in a way. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a few hacks or a few kind of how-tos of what the tricks were that also helped on the individual level for these individuals to think interdisciplinarily and also see the benefits of leveraging this collaborative technology for actually being better public servants.
Yeah, in the cover of the book, there is two traditional Mandarin characters, Shu Wei. And in Taiwan, they mean both digital and plural. So Shu Wei Buzhang, digital minister, means the minister of more than one, or more than one ministers, plural as in grammatical category. The idea of Shu Wei is twofold. It is saying that to be digital is to be plural, to be in service of plurality, but also means that to further institutional pluralism, digital technologies can help. And so these two are very much intertwined in my job description in 2016. When I first became the digital minister, there was no digital minister position before, so I'm asked to write my own job description. And it's a very small prayer, so I will recite it now. It goes like this. When we see the Internet of Things, let's make it an Internet of beings. When we see virtual reality, let's make it a shared reality. When we see machine learning, let's make it collaborative learning. When we see user experience, let's make it about human experience. And whenever we hear the singularity is near, let's always remember the plurality is here. And so that's literally my job description. And so, so I think the hack here is to not let solutionism, not let this fix-it-ism to drive the conversation. In my HR form in 2016, the gender field, I wrote not applicable. And also in the party affiliation field, I also wrote not applicable. And so I'm non-binary, not just in gender, but in everything. So whenever I see a situation where my brain tells me there's half of population closer to me and half of population farther away from me, I see it as a problem of me, not a problem of that stakeholder group. And I would just go to them. I often just go to the vicinity and do a ethnographic, or just hanging out with people for a while until I can see things from their perspective. And almost always, this idea of taking all the sides results in a much more collaborative bridge-making policy, as opposed to this winner-takes-all policy. So I think the hack is just being non-binary. So when people say that I'm the world's first non-binary cabinet minister, I say, no, I'm just the first openly non-binary. Everybody is in the closet. You all have the potential.
Here. So first hack, we kind of check the box,
yes,
and we take that with us. And it's interesting though, because the way you describe it, full of passion, also shows, for me, to a certain extent, this creative tension that we have.
Yep.
Because on one hand, you say we should all be non-binary,
No, of course.
but at the same time, we're here to scale technology that is intrinsically binary.
I know, it's digital, 10 digits, you know.
Exactly. So I wanted to then zoom in a little bit more, because with you, Glenn, we really also have somebody who's been at the forefront, be it at Microsoft Research, but also the previous work that you've been doing. And what I'd be very interesting also to hear from you now after the book is coming out, and also a lot of technological innovations are currently happening. Some that still need demystification. I mean, that's clearly something that's necessary. Could you share with us some of those most promising technological innovations that support these principles of plurality and democratic engagement that we might have to be more aware of in the broader discussion at the moment, where everything is basically swooped over by the Gen AI hype and many other aspects that are very also kind of profit-driven?
Well, I think we heard it in what Marie Doa said already, which is what NATO is already doing, understood a little bit more mathematically, systematically, I think is a pattern for so much else that could occur. So, I was trained as an economist, thanks to a gentleman in the front here. And in economics, we are taught to think about international cooperation as stripping away subsidies, stripping away industrial policy, stripping away investment by the public, and that is logical under a very special model of how the economy works. It's true if everything is private goods and no externalities, and which is to me a little bit like if you lived on Lineland, then you could describe the physics of Lineland, which is very interesting, but it's not necessarily the only way to think about a three-dimensional space, right? And on the other hand, if you have public goods, if you have increasing returns, if you have industries and capabilities, then common investment is very important to make things work. And maybe the right way to think about international cooperation is not stripping away the national investments, but making investments together, making them interoperable, making them cross over allies. And maybe there's actually a whole theory that is already in practice in NATO, but that can become possible in theory as well as in practice using mathematics and social science. So one thing we developed in this line is this idea called quadratic funding. This is a model that is derived from economic theory, but where the foundation is public goods rather than private goods, and where there's a matching pool, and things get funded if they have diverse contributors. So you get matching not just for individual contributions, but if you get it from many. So in the context of allies, you could think of that as NATO has a common matching pool, and it matches investments in shared capabilities from many different member states. And therefore, it does not say from the top down, but it also doesn't leave it to the market. It supports multilateral cooperation in an agnostic and decentralized way. And to me, that's a simple technology, but I think it's a very powerful one. It allows us to really rethink what we mean by international cooperation, not as stripping down, but as building up, as bridging the capabilities and investments and within countries and bringing it to a broader level. And the discipline that is given us by the mathematics allows us to do it in a way that is more decentralized and more broadly empowering than if you just have a very small number of people that are in NATO staff figuring out what is a cooperative project.
So I think the question directly is also handed over to you, Marie-Laure.
I think I definitely need you as an advisor on the mathematics side of things. But thank you for, I mean, this resonates really well with NATO's DNA, which, as you're seeing, is interoperability. In a way, NATO is about standards. That's what it's about. It's about shared standards so that natively things actually work. And this is how we are able to get new allies to join us so fast, like Sweden and Finland, who are already super interoperable because even when they were not allies, they had already been working on, how to train together, do operations together. So the minute they joined, we were speaking the same language, and it's very concrete. It means when, two warships meet and one has, every single piece is duplicated on the ship, and you can actually swap key elements to function. So this is really important from the military technical side of things, but this is also something we're leveraging, of course, in terms of knowledge. And in many respects, NATO doesn't produce its own knowledge. I mean, for example, my colleague in charge of the intelligence division doesn't produce knowledge. He collects knowledge willingly provided by the nations to build NATO's global situational awareness. And I like to think of the work of my division, and then coming back to disinformation, as also an important contribution to this situational awareness of NATO. And I think it's probably something a bit new that we've been doing in the past 9 months, which is really both raising the level of awareness on what's happening in the information space, not doing it on our own, so leveraging partners and like-minded friends from all over who have all sorts of different templates. NATO is a fantastic place to be looking at this in a way because we all have different templates. Some of us focus more, we work a lot with other partners like the EU, for example, so they would focus more on democracy, on elections. We would focus more on security. Others focus more on this or that geography or linguistic area. So we take all this and we try to give it back to allies in the form of a shared and global picture so that they can make use of it. So yes, I think that's globally.
Audrey didn't describe it on the cover of the book. It's not shown here, but if you go outside, you'll see it. The logo for Plurality is 2 interlocking squares with a little area of overlap and a rainbow where that overlap occurs. And so that's exactly the image that you just described. It is distinct foci that intersect and that create strength through both their difference and their intersection.
And maybe in your image actually resonates with very concrete examples of how we work not only as allies but with other existing organizations who have already achieved that collaboration themselves. Yeah. And I'm thinking about the EU, of course, and our closest partner is probably the European Action Service, External Action Service. So they've already built that with their member states, and then we're bringing new allies to that. So being invited and making sure that we can share info with whoever we want to share it with, and making sure that we can leverage that real time for the best political use. And so we do that with the EIS, we do that with the G7, and so we have mechanisms. Yeah. They have fancy names like rapid response mechanisms or alert mechanisms, but the whole point is that we're all making that effort not to duplicate, but to share the info real time.
But people, it sounds like political. It doesn't sound like technology. But the internet, the definition of the internet is a network of networks. That is the origin of that name. It is precisely that philosophy of incompletely but importantly interoperable differing groups, and the digital structure that empowers that kind of interoperable cooperation. And really our whole project is, how do we extend that to more? How do we empower more? How do we lift up and allow us to have more focus on the kind of, fabulous work that you all are engaged in?
What I also find super interesting, and thank you, Marie-Doha, for pointing that out, that you're also laboratory in many ways, because you pointed out the notion of interoperability by design, the standards that need to be set. We talked about terminology, and also demystification to a certain extent. And what strikes me anytime, we talk about kind of the realpolitik angle at the end of the day, you don't have to struggle too much with this whole question of alignment of incentives. I think the incentive is there. It's the defense, it's the protection of, also the alliance to a certain extent. And within it, then you have circumstances there where it's pretty focused to that extent. And when talking about plurality, it's not always the first place somebody would go to and say, NATO is a laboratory in that sense. But I find it quite striking with the incentive question.
I think one word on that is that NATO's mandate is really preserving peace and preventing conflict. I think this is very key. And every time you have a new ally, which we just had 2 new allies, it changes the whole balance. So for example, talk about resilience, our topics today, bring in the Swedes and see what happens. It's amazing. Their own knowledge of societal resilience, their own psychological defense agency, that's all new. And they're bringing this to the others who suddenly, want to step up and start learning with them. And it brings the level up very fast. Yeah.
And speaking then about institutions in this case, and also other multilateral bodies, Arantxa, I would like to also bring you back into the discussion, because not only now, from the vantage point of, a very reputable also academic institution, but also your own personal experience as Minister of Foreign Affairs, and also having been part of many multilateral structures. I was wondering also if you see our current international system, institutional-wise, also being set up for actually scaling this type of collaborative technology, and if there's anything that stands out to you now, having also heard a little bit from Glenn, Audrey, and Marie-Doha in this sense.
No, I think the Secretary General is trying his best to create this new space for multilateralism on technology, trying to bridge 2 big gaps that I see when I look at the world compared to when I look at NATO, or I look at the EU, which is a huge interoperability machine that has been working for decades now, where you have both a definition of something that replaces the national, but also lots of spaces where you don't replace the national, you add a new layer called is the 27 plus, the one where they all share. But I see a difficulty in doing this multilaterally. One is obviously a problem of design. The multilateral system is built on verticals, and these are very strong verticals, and they are very strong verticals because they replicate the verticals of the governments, of the nation states. So you've got food is for food, and you've got intellectual property is for intellectual property, and you've got trade is for trade, and then you got health is for health. But guess what? All these are today problems that are interconnected. So when trying to advance technological multilateralism, the Secretary General is finding it very difficult, because he's got to break the vested interest of all these verticals. But he's also finding a second problem that is a little bit more difficult, because one is design. I mean, in the end, you can also always find the incentives or disincentives for design, right? But he's got a second problem, which is a problem of interests and culture. And interests today are not pulling in the direction of pooling efforts. It's pulling in the direction of separating, fragmenting. And even in areas like climate change, where we should, or fighting pandemics, which are systemic areas, where applying a zero-sum game mentality is just basically defeating the very purpose. It's difficult even in these 2 areas of climate change and health, and you can see this. You see what's happening with the negotiations for a new treaty on pandemics. You see what's happening in the area of climate change, and how do we build financing mechanisms that can help those that are not capable of mobilizing enough financial resources to face the adaptation or the mitigation that is required. We have a problem of fragmentation, and we have a problem of zero-sum mentality. And this zero-sum mentality is both dangerous and much more difficult to deal with. I mean, it's easier to do in NATO, of course, because these are allies. Although I also want to put a bit of a question mark on this issue of allies, depending on what the US voters will decide later this year, because I can tell you on this side of the Atlantic there is a lot of nervousness. But let's say that culturally, interest, values, NATO is an alliance. But the UN, it's a collection of nations deciding or not deciding to cooperate. So here is, Martin, where I see the difficulty in trying to build these collaborative spaces on technology that are nevertheless important because there are huge ethical issues that are cut across. There are huge economic issues that cut across. Concentration of wealth, it's an issue that should matter as much in the north as it does in the south, in the east as it does in the west. And yet I see enormous difficulties in overcoming that.
Thank you, Arantxa. And if you don't mind, could we maybe also then hone in a little bit on the European perspective then in this case? Because we are just now at the end of a commission that has been world-renowned for its regulatory might in many ways. And we are also at a point where European citizens are asking, and I think interestingly so also, what will the next commission, but also what will the democratic system that we are within right now also deliver us on the day-to-day matters that are there. And having talked about the laboratory that NATO is, and also the challenges of the big multilateral bodies within our Westphalian system, this old operating model that might not be up to speed, is the European Union and this big experiment that's supranational maybe also something to be considered as an experience that can inform plurality in the future when it comes to technology?
I mean, let's say that what we have seen in this last 5 years in the previous commission is an attempt at putting some rules into the manner in which technology is impacting the EU, but obviously the EU being a big market and breathing a lot with the rest of the world, hoping to make sure that these regulatory approaches could be exported or rather adopted elsewhere than in Europe. So I would say that stage one of this regulatory edifice is there. But we now have two difficulties, which I hope will be dealt with in the next commission. Difficulty number one is the first layer of bricks in the European regulatory edifice leaves lots of things to be defined. And at the moment, we are seeing companies in the technology space defined this in very different ways. Public interest, abusing of children, there are lots of definitions that have not been sharpened and therefore interpreted differently by different companies. And companies are free to define them.
That's what interoperability even means. Yeah. For DMA and everything.
Yeah, but I mean, you have to start from a same definition, and I don't think the definition is clear. So the second layer has to be about definitions. I see my good friend Bernard Benamou, with whom we are working on putting a few proposals for the French president on building a second layer of this edifice as regards foreign interference through the information spaces. And we realized that the first layer was great, but this first layer is not enough to protect the European democratic spaces. The second difficulty that Europe has faced is one of competitiveness. So regulating the technology spaces is great, But you've got to do an exercise also at improving the capacity of the European economy to be a competitive economy. And I don't think we've paid enough attention to this space. So I do hope that these two, sharpening the European toolbox on the regulatory side, in particular as regards democratic spaces, because there is one thing on which Europeans agree, or at least the vast majority of European agree, is that we are a democratic space, and these democratic spaces are today challenged also through the use of technology in the information spaces. So second layer of the edifice and competitiveness would be two big priorities for the next Commission and the next European Parliament.
Here. I mean, it'll be an interesting couple of weeks, that's for sure.
Here.
Audrey, I'd be very interested then in your view on this as well, because when we look at the multilateral world, Taiwan with its very specific history, of course, and then also the role that it plays and the pressures that it's also under, how do you see this old, let's say, operating system also functioning and being fit for purpose for the vision of plurality? And then maybe to add on to what Arantxa was just saying, do you think that in that context, as this Brussels effect to a certain extent that still is, going around, is this something beneficial for the vision, or is it something that might also be detrimental when it comes to spreading the word globally?
Yeah, we're certainly inspired by not just GDPR, DMA, DSA, DA, and many regulatory inspirations here, but also because we don't have a kind of direct schedule from Brussels. We can, and many times, just jump frog. So when we hear a good idea, like data altruism organization or joint controllership, whatever that means in GDPR, we can take that idea and just capitalize on that, because we don't have to wait for the other member countries in order to get interoperability. So we are free to, for example, when our constitutional court took the GDPR spirit and say that, the idea of re-identifiable information and whatever, nowadays we have good PET, privacy enhancing technology, so it has to be like the highest standard, like zero knowledge, or very few wiggle room when it comes to the privacy budget for synthetic data and things like that. And so when our constitutional court made that ruling, I think they did it with the spirit of GDPR, but not how GDPR is interpreted in many member countries. So we can afford to go to the higher level, and in which case it creates a new market on federated learning, on homomorphic encryptions, on investment in chips that accelerated the zero knowledge proof, which would not be possible if we have wiggle room on the interpretation of what does it mean actually to join in data sharing in a way that's actually zero knowledge, right? And then we build upon that and say only data altruism organizations that can prove that they share in an NPD fashion, non-personal data fashion, instead of a somewhat still re-identifiable fashion, can get subsidies and rewards from the government and so on. And again, that's like way before the data altruism organizations are getting that sort of subsidies or credentials. But all these ideas came from the EU. It was just we interpreted in a way that's kind of maximizing its privacy and also human rights impacts. So yes, I do think there is a leading effect, kind of a moral leadership effect on this. But I think the mobility in Taiwan, just because we're not technically part of the UN or part of the EU or part of NATO or whatever, we can afford to be a lab and tell Meta and Google that I don't care how many years do EU give you for gatekeeper sunrise or sunset, we want it now. And if next month you do not implement this, then I'm sorry, but you have full liability on people lost to investment scams or whatever. We understand the EU gives you like 12 months, but sorry, it's 12 weeks in Taiwan. So we can afford to do that. And then in the disinformation, countering disinformation ecosystem, a very similar thing is happening, right? People don't wait for the state or for the legislature to do anything. The leading antivirus companies, the leading NGOs and INGOs in Taiwan are already building that and sharing it to NATO in many conferences and panels. So I think, yeah, Taiwan benefits from not not being part of the schedule, but we also benefit from being the place where we can experiment with these ideas free from the scheduling constraints. So it plays kind of both sides of the good and the bad, but I think currently the good outweighs the bad. Yeah.
Interesting. And I mean, the way you're describing it also becomes even more interesting when we also, again, underline that Taiwan is punching above its weight when it comes to semiconductors in many ways. And we had this short discussion before we had the meeting.
Yes.
Because everything you just described when it comes to, the ability to share data.
It requires compute, yes.
It requires compute. And the whole question also comes into play, where does this innovation take place? And Taiwan being this laboratory on the governance, but also the societal kind of, initiatives that fill this with life. Could you help us demystify also a little bit what role the fact that there is this globally leading semiconductor industry actually on the island with all of its political baggage, of course, and geopolitical reasons, does it play a role? And
it
are you
does.
hopeful
It does.
seeing
It
what is
does.
being developed?
Yeah, when I was born, which is 81, which is also the year that personal computers was born, there is a huge change in the Taiwanese mentality because people know that the martial law after 4 decades is finally coming to an end, which was lifted in 87. And in the decade that followed until the first presidential election, which was 96, the 10 years is where the civil society, the journalists, and so on just experimented with this newfound freedom. And that was also the decade from personal computer to the World Wide Web. And so the societal difference, I think, in Taiwan is that we don't have 2 groups of people, one doing technology and one doing democracy. They are literally the same generation, the same people that do technology and democracy, because personal computer means desktop publishing. Desktop publishing means that you can do the press without waiting for government sanctioned to be lifted. Even under the government sanction, you can afford to print your own thing and so on. So the dial-up BBS or whatever, the hobbyist network, all of this were also used in democratization as well. And so I think the idea of the civil society organization having a higher legitimacy compared to government is not unique to Taiwan, but what's unique is that they also have higher technical capability compared to the government, which is not the case in many developing democracies, which is why when G0B or Gov0 started, people know that in the civil society organizations, you can find engineers from MediaTek, from TSMC, from Trend Micro, like the cutting edge people, and they carry with them this notion of personal computing, which means that we don't have to wait for the lords and ladies with mainframes determining what we're going to compute. We can just use VisiCalc or WordStar or whatever, the early hobbyist computing to do our own publishing and advocating our own platforms and do democratization. And I think this also extends to AI. When we run the alignment assembly, which is like a citizens assembly and so on the AI futures, Taiwan has a very strong tendency in this idea of AI PC, like AI personal computing, and people want the government to experiment with this kind of community-owned tuning and so on. So people collectively do what's called a constitution, people's expectation of AI models, and they expect the science ministry to tune an AI that conform to the Taiwanese norm. And when I say, to people that I fine-tune my own language model replying to emails on this MacBook, and data doesn't go anywhere, people assume that the cost will drop, that the personal computing chips will enable everybody to do that in the next couple of years. So there's less of this learned helplessness of the overlords in the cloud controlling every private details of our conversation. But there is this general expectation that just like personal computing, all these cutting edge technologies will be democratized as part of course, our chip making, and also able to be remixed in a way that is open to the civil society's ideas of how to steer it instead of just a large capitalist or statist ideas of how to do it. It's the same kind of remixing freedom, right? You can remix any tea and any bubble and still call it a bubble tea, right? So the idea of open innovation is very much part of the Taiwanese psyche. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's super interesting, and I won't go towards the whole question of dual use then also of the semiconductors, because that could be an endless discussion. But I wanted to come back to you, Glenn, for a moment, because when you were also pointing out the vision again of the book and plurality, you referred again to this whole also superpower that are digital public goods in many ways. And I think it's again one of those terms that needs demystification, especially because they're being thrown, from what we can also see from our vantage points currently in this wide debate that digital public infrastructure is the solution for everything, and what is happening in India is so great and best practice, and you can buy a lemon with a QR code, etc. And I'd be very interested in your viewpoint also there, because the pendulum is swinging. Folks are waking up that there needs to be shared technological stack, governance is important, but already there's the sense that the nuance gets missing, that folks are jumping onto centralized solutions, for example, that have within them some promise of plurality or common approaches. And I was wondering also what you're thinking about this development at this stage.
Well, I mean, look, there's a good reason why people are having the conversation in that way, because there's just a basic logic here that I think is missing from the current way the technology works. You think about where does investment in technology research and development and deployment come in the West? It's about 90 to 95% private sector. And the cost structure of the tech industry is, if you go to economic theory again, thank you again, Professor Guriev, it would say that when you have increasing returns, when you have low marginal costs relative to average costs, you would expect to have a very important role for public investment in making things happen. And in fact, that's not just an expectation, like that's how infrastructure works for most of the economy. And there is no part of the economy that is more that way than the digital sector is. So the baseline fact that you have an open source ecosystem that, for all its good and bad, is completely for the public good. I mean, there's just like nothing else going on other than that. And that there's, like, to a first approximation, zero funding from the public and charitable sectors for that sector. In fact, they get punished. They're not treated sometimes even as favorably as for-profit companies are treated. This, first order, before we go into any nuance, this is a huge problem. If we don't find a way to solve this, we're literally like, to take Mark Andreessen's example, but in a completely different direction, machine gunning ourselves in the foot. You're taking the most dynamic, the most increasing return sector of the economy, the most public good-oriented sector of the economy, and you're actually punishing it for serving the public good. So we've got to figure out a way to get past that. And if the digital public infrastructure conversation gets us past that, like, absolutely, that's the conversation we should be having. At the same time, the word public is not such a nuanced word. Who is the public here? NATO is a public. These language groups you're talking about, these are all publics. There is no one public. And the notion that a single nation state is the public is a very strange way of thinking about what the term public means, and certainly not the way that lines up with open source code, right? So we need to have many publics. And I think, J.C.R. Licklider, I very strongly recommend an essay by him called Computers and Government from 1980. One of, I think, maybe best essay I've ever read on public policy. But he actually in that argued that our notion of publics was so dysfunctional that maybe actually the United States should not export computer technology at all. Because once it did, there would be no public support anymore for the development of computation, because it would no longer be seen as a vital national interest. And that we would end up in such a dystopian scenario when everything's driven by the private sector, that maybe it was better to just leave it within nation. And we didn't do that, and maybe that was good that we didn't do that. But we urgently, if that happens, need to solve the NATO problem. We need to have massive, coordinated, transnational investment in supporting public infrastructure. But not just nation-state based, because that's not going to work. That's not the spirit of the internet. So, I look forward, and soon, to a day when, just like would be true in anything with the same cost sector in any other area of the economy, 60-70% of the funding for software development comes from public and charitable sources. 60 to 70%, not 5%. That should be the dominant character, I believe, of the digital sector. And of course, the private sector has a role to play as well, a complementary role to play, just as it complements in defense, right? But it's in a supporting role. It's not in the driver's seat, right? So that is a future that I think we need to say, and we need it to be plural on every level. It needs to be transnational. It needs to have many publics involved, not just one public. It needs to not think of just replicating the most simplistic notions of the infrastructure there, just money and whatever. It needs to actually embody pluralism. It needs to actually push forward human rights and the notions of human rights. It needs to be experimental. It needs to be raising the standard, and it needs to embody the spirit that ARPA did, talking again of defense, where, just like Taiwan does, we don't just set standards in a defensive way and force people to come up to them. We want the allies to be competing to push forward what is the best practice. Not to just standardize the best practice, but to challenge others to have better and better and more creative and more pluralistic practices. So.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. I'm really glad that you brought up the point of funding at the end of the day, because it's clearly not a level playing field at this stage. And we not only see this from a European perspective when it comes to the numbers of representatives in the lobbying offices around the Commission, of actually also defining what publicly serving technology might be, what sovereign data structures are, what certain of those terms mean. And at the same time, I think we agree here that this is a challenge, but also are still, I think, searching for what those impulses are. Next to, of course, the framing through plurality and also, the narrative that you're trying, to push forward to actually flip this to a certain extent, because it doesn't feel like there are decades left to actually do so at this stage, because there are big power concentrations. And maybe one last point I wanted to make, because we'll also in a sec will open for Q&As and actually have a look at the Polis questionnaire that we've been circulating in a moment. But there are echoes also from the sustainability and sustainable development kind of ecosystem there, where also now very innovative approaches are being put forward when it comes to blended financing, infrastructure building, system change thinking to a certain extent. And again, from our silo of digital data and also technology policy, I'm wondering if there are also experience there to be had, because there are other institutions, there are other cooperation mechanisms that of course all also have a literacy or competency in regards to technology. And I mean, those things are interlinked in many ways. So maybe just as an observation there as well. But I was wondering, again, Marie-Doha, if any additional thoughts popped up that you wanted to share with us, and then also Arantxa, because this way we have everybody nice in the round before we can open for Q&A.
This is very inspiring. Maybe just one word on, of course, this notion of sovereignty, which is always very much brought up in an alliance. It's the big challenge. And as Arantxa said, the way the world is going is not exactly helpful in that respect. And so from a NATO perspective, it's true that it's a little miracle, this thing that's been going on for 75 years, because by nature, if you think of the topics that are being discussed or even negotiated, they're by nature not negotiable, because it's about national security. And so indeed this works, this alignment only works if there's an aligned perception of risks. And so, I mean, yeah, it's just a general remark. But I mean, this applies, for example, in the case of Ukraine. NATO is incredibly united, and in a way, it's a piece of luck that everyone really agrees on the responses and so on. But it's permanent work. It really doesn't just happen because of the topics involved. But, yeah.
Just to be a little bit provocative on that topic, I think one way to think a little bit in a pluralistic way about those challenges is perhaps not always to be so defensive about the existing networks of cooperation, and actually be proactive about new cleavages being potentially helpful if they cross-cut existing cleavages. So for example, there's been a lot of dismayed writing in certain quarters about the international networks that are being formed by national conservative organizations within Europe and the United States. And I understand some of that, but I would also challenge people to think about how interesting it is that we are forming new transnational alliances of people who share some things and not other things in a way that is actually among people who are the most skeptical of international cooperation. So isn't that interesting? Isn't that potentially relevant for international cooperation? And perhaps the fact that that's also in conflict with some other things is not the worst thing of all, because maybe, Alexis de Tocqueville has this analogy of a quilt. A quilt, the issue is not that the stitches in the quilt, it's good to have stitches in a quilt. The problem is if they're all along one axis, then the quilt can tear. But if they cross-cut each other, the quilt is strong. And so if you just focus on one, maybe you're dismayed about those national conservative alliances. But then if you think about the broader pattern into which they fit, maybe they're actually quite powerful. And I think maybe also sometimes people think a little bit about religion in these terms. They think religion is a source of division. Well, perhaps, and perhaps within a certain social context. But you think, Catholics are maybe 15% of the United States, and the United States is 10% of Catholics. So is that something that divides or that connects? Well, it depends what context you see it within. And actually, maybe if we proliferate those cleavages, and if we ensure that they cut across existing divides, perhaps the overall quilt becomes stronger. So I would challenge us to actually kind of lean into the potential of debate, the potential of divides, as long as they don't all correlate with each other to actually make a stronger overall fabric.
I mean, what else can we say other than Arantxa, your opinion?
No, I mean, I'm gonna go. I mean, I very much agree with you on that, and I love the analogy of the quilt. I was going to talk more about the financing piece, which at the end of the day is where the rubber hits the road.
Yeah.
And I think we have a problem of. I don't think we have a problem of capital. I don't think we have a problem of financing. I think we have a problem of directing the financing and blending this financing and pulling the financing in the right direction and with the right incentives. And the right incentives are not there at the moment. And I'll give you a very concrete example. It's going to be parochial because I'm in Europe. We are in Europe, and we do have a problem of European capital markets. It's not that we don't have the capital, is that the markets are not integrated enough, and therefore 300 billion of European savings go every year to the US, to more liquid capital markets with better returns, instead of investing this capital into the European Union to public together with private in an intelligent way, build the necessary tech infrastructure, build the necessary climate transition, build the necessary social safety nets and the rest. So we do have a huge issue of international financial architecture, of national financial incentives and disincentives that we need to fix if we are to build these public goods, as I think we should, because a lot of what we've been talking about is financing global public goods. And we will not be able to get there, or we will do this for the happy few, but not for the, poorer many, if we don't tackle heads-on this issue of financing.
Here. So with this, I would like to then actually open also the discussion, and thank you again for being so open. To not only the folks that are joining us here in the room, but also those that already through the polis questionnaire had the chance ahead of the event to not only suggest questions, but also vote on them. And I hand over to Pierre, who will actually take us through some of the observations and questions that popped out. I think we start with that, and then later we also open up here within the room.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you very much for this fascinating discussion. And thank to all of you who have contributed to the police. So several dozens of you actually chipped in, and we reached a bit more than 200 votes. So it's really, really great. And so what we're going to do is that I'm going to read to you some of the statements that have been submitted to the police. First, starting with probably the most consensual ones, then perhaps a few divisive ones, just to get you warmed up, and then we're going to open up the floor. We're going to have the panel react to those statements. Would you agree fully with them? Would you actually tweak them, right? Like perhaps suggest something else? And because some of you might not have had the opportunity to contribute to the police, we're actually going to have a visualizer, and I'm going to ask you to raise your hands if you agree. And since Glenn mentioned already some alternative voting methods with quadratic funding and quadratic voting, I'd like us to do a bit of conviction voting. Any one of you are familiar with conviction voting? Conviction voting is a voting method in which you can express your agreement, your disagreement, but also how much you agree. So if you really agree with the statement, when you raise your hand, shake it as well, okay? And if you just agree with it, just raise your hand. And if you don't, or if you don't care, just keep your hands down, okay? So the first statement that I would like to start with is really the banger one, the most consensual one. 90% of the people voted agree with this one. So nationalist parties are gaining speed in every developed country. Tools that might make international governance more transparent and participative can be a response and give this international governance more legitimacy. Do you agree with this statement? Okay. All right. All right. So perhaps a bit less conceptual for people in the room than on police. Who wants to react to this first statement on international governance and having those tools to gain, to infuse more legitimacy into international governance? On the panel?
Yeah, I think it's true. I think it's, I mean, you can't build, you know, a national governance is close to the citizen. International governance is very far away from the citizen. So you've got to connect the two. And you cannot connect the two if this is not transparent, if it is not clear, if it is not understood, if it's not debated. Because by definition, you don't see it, you know? I mean, we have this problem in Europe, which is not, you know, it's some sort of mid-step between the international and the purely national. It's the first stage in the supranational. But, you know, you've got to have additional doses of transparency in order to build the legitimacy of the international.
I mean, I think coming back to the thing I was mentioning earlier, I think that, you know, let's say Europe, just to be very concrete, a European Union-wide pre-election polis type system, I think might well surface the existence of, you know, cross-national divides between, you know, the what's usually called the far-right groups and much of the rest of the population. I think that would be super healthy because you might end up with the most powerfully European, federalist configuration. Exactly. The most powerfully European federalist configuration actually being the anti-European federalist grouping. And what would that do to politics? I mean, that would be very fascinating, right? Like if what everyone's been talking about Spitzenkandidat and whatever came together most strongly for the far right, I think that would be very interesting and healthy. So I think that could do wonders in a whole bunch of ways.
Perhaps another statement to react to. Now we're getting into ones that are a bit still quite consensual, but a lot of people being uncertain about it. And I think on this one, I would really love to hear what Audrey has to say about this, because I'm sure you faced this issue. Many underrepresented communities also have a limited access on knowledge of digital technologies. Tools like this can only strengthen democracy if we close the digital divide, the digital gap. and make sure that those very underrepresented communities are included in the conversations. Do we agree with this? One person only. Okay. So perhaps, Audrey, you want to...
Well, just procedurally, when we read aloud those consensus, we sort by amount of consensus. So there's actually another consensus of 90% that we kind of missed, which I want to honor first, which is any technologies for coordination need to be paired with legal counterparts. That is to say, without some sort of legal guarantee or institutionalization, these are just experiments. I wouldn't say experiments are not good, but I mean, after all, people want pre-commitment. People want to know that when you do reach 90% consensus, it will be read out. Of course, it's not the law here, but but yet. No, but it is important to honor the procedure, because if you do not honor the procedure, either with law or regulation or things like that, then there is no guarantee that the next administration, the next whim, the next buzzword will replace this fairness of conversation. And this is exactly why in Taiwan, broadband is a human right, is written into multiple regulations and laws. It is not just a slogan, but rather it is part of our universal service regulation, it's part of our 5G spectrum allocation, auction rules, and so on. So it's not just one or two hacks that makes it happen, but rather a kind of top-down commitment to use every regulation and every law to make sure that any administration or any governor or any municipality that want to somehow leave somebody behind will face trouble in the court. So I think this is doubly important when it comes to transparency and participation, because for many people in public service, when they hear large-scale public participation, the first thing they hear is it's extra risk. It is something that may hurt their minister's image. It may be something that makes them work until 9 p.m. Or things like that. But only when we institutionalize that, when we set up this, like Taiwan, we have a regulation for participation officers for each and every ministry to have dedicated teams that to make sure that they understand how to use the e-petition platform, the participatory regulatory platform, and things like that, until there is now institutional memory after 7 years that every bit of the collaborative meeting will not result in explosion. Every bit of it will result in more signal, and therefore you can go off work by 5 p.m. and not 9 p.m. When you run consultation like this, the machine-based facilitation can reduce even the most violent conflicts, like police, into the bridge-making exercise. And only when all these are written into regulations can we certainly now say, oh, the people who previously had no voice, the very rural people, people who we cannot directly connect to, we have to help the helpers, they are now every bit as likely as the people in the urban places to start petition with 5,000 people, to summon and minister to their whereabouts, and so on, just because all the public service related to it now see it as a time saver and sometimes as a risk reducer as well. So it is deeply connected with the institutionalization of things. Yeah.
Thank you very much for keeping me accountable on this. Those are the
Very
benefits
important
of radical
accountability.
transparency.
Yes.
For disclosure, this statement was at one person voting against it, so it ranked slightly below in my metric. So it was not disingenuous of me. I didn't censor.
Okay, it's
I didn't
not
censor the
censorship.
statement.
It's not censorship.
Yeah. One last statement on which I would like you to react, just to warm up, and then I will share the mic with the rest of the room. This one is really quite in the middle in terms of support. Is how do we achieve, like, those tools are successful at a local level, right? We've seen it in Taiwan, we've seen it, for instance, in Spain, with Barcelona being a hotspot of local participative democracy, with a lot of people investing time and effort building open source technology as well to support those conversations. How do we move from local to global with those technologies, right? How do we achieve this scale up, and how do we spur adoption? First, do we all agree with this statement that this is really quite a challenge to move from local to global?
Sure.
All right. Well, probably the most consensual statement so far. All from global to
Yeah,
local.
or from global to local.
Yes.
I would say this is more of a challenge.
Yeah.
So, one last reaction, and then you will have the mic for your own questions.
I think I don't know what your name is, but what?
Katya?
Katya. I thought Katya to me captured it perfectly, which is that I would encourage a step away from the term global and a step towards the term plurilocal. Because people say, well, it only works locally to the Ethereum community. It only works locally to Catalonia. It only works locally to, Taoism, community. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, so there's many different local communities where it works. But together you take a lot of local communities along many dimensions, and somehow now you're actually talking about something much more interesting. So that, many locals is maybe often better than global.
Yeah, we've spent many decades globalizing the local, and we've not paid enough attention to localizing the global. And this is where we've had a bit of an issue, because what matters at the end of the day is the local. So, both ways.
Yeah, and I want to problematize the word scale, because in the statement, the scale is used in a way of either scaling out, like many more people using it, or scaling up, meaning that it become more and more capable. But in Taiwan, especially in the GovZero movement, we talk about scaling deeply, meaning that it's like a rhizome that it's infused in more and more of public sector's thinking. It's infused in more and more impact investors' thinking and so on, so that when people immediately think about, let's start a spreadsheet or let's start a Google form, people can also think about, let's start a polis conversation, let's start a collaborative fact-checking session, let's do something like this with open source. But it is not scaling in the original scaling out or scaling up sense. It is more like, let's make it a norm sense. And when you have that, then kind of magically you find like-minded people on GitHub, on Discord, on many other places, and these innovations grow in a people-to-people way to many plurilocal communities. So it still grows like a rhizome that grows, but it's not growing in a very visible way where you get a venture capital of 5 million investment, or whether you immediately get addictive user base of 1 million. You don't see many of that, but actually over time then people's culture change and people automatically go to these open source collaboration just because they know it is possible. So there's also scaling deeply in addition to scaling out and scaling up.
Audrey the other day said, when I was a little bit concerned that on the first day the book came out, it wasn't immediately a bestseller because it was not done by the publisher in the normal way with the publicity. Like we didn't have any of those.
It took
affordances.
24 hours to become a bestseller. And Glenn was very nervous. 24 hours.
And Audrey said, build slow and repair things. Don't move fast and break things. Right.
That's
So that builds more resilient structures. I think.
One maybe also quick observation, because it goes back to what you, Audrey, said before when it came to needing to honor the procedure, also in many ways, and the whole question of agency accountability, and what you just also mentioned in regards to the scaling out, scaling up, and scaling in. Again, those are those echoes of culture at the end of the day.
Yes.
And there is no global culture. It's the plurilocal culture in many ways, and this beauty of heterogeneity, and at the same time the resilience of it, and also the success of, let's say, the Catholic Church, because it integrated the unbelievable diversity in many ways, for better or for worse. We can also open this one up. But again, just to throw in also the notion of culture to a certain extent, which is a very complex, of course, concept, but again, I find it very fascinating when it echoes even in technology discussions on scaling plurality.
Yeah, in the book, we always talk about being transcultural, right? So the culture of the book is a transcultural culture, right? It is not specific to any particular culture, but just the recognition that being transcultural is the only way to collaborate across diversity, to see diversity as not something that explodes, but something that you can harness for co-creation. Yeah.
And on the spirit of culture, I might invite, perhaps before we turn to the floor, to watch an element of culture and move away from the intellectual element. 3 minutes of culture.
Do we have it ready? So perhaps while we set it up, perhaps we can take a first question.
Sure.
Yes.
Right?
Sure.
Yeah.
So please raise your hand this time, not to vote, but just to let me know if... All right, Paola.
Thank you. Hi, so I'm Paola Forteza. I've been an MP, a French MP, for a couple of years. We've met already several times around the OGP and all that. And I was wondering, what are the last examples you've met or you encountered on around open parliament, and how would you apply this very interesting notion of plurality to the lawmaking process?
Yeah, that's a great question. My one of the last citizen assemblies that I helped run, presenting a draft to the parliament, is done in a very interesting way. It is called Alignment Assembly on Information Integrity. And what it does is that because people know deep fakes and cheap fakes and whatever are coming, many MPs want us to tackle the online fraud and things like that. But they have this immense pressure because the fraud issue is really high internationally. But people don't want the state to over-regulate the social media platform, because the idea goes, if we over-regulate, only the 2 largest platforms can survive, and everything else that is domestic to Taiwan will be destroyed by the compliance cost and so on. So they also want us to be proportionate. But instead of going through a year or so of debate, we simply sent 200,000 SMS numbers randomly with a survey that says, what do you feel about online harms that's caused by AI? And it comes from 111, the government official number, so people know it comes from the state. But a survey is like police. So it is not asking people just to answer the 10 measures, but rather what other measures can you think to tackle this issue? And out of the people who replied, we chose 450 people by stratified random sampling, meaning that is as rigorous as any poll, so that those 400 people are a microcosm of the Taiwanese population. But unlike the French example of like the end-of-life citizen assembly, which invited them to a face-to-face meeting, we simply invited them to online meeting. And in online meeting, they're facilitated 10 at a time by robots. So instead of a human facilitator, we can robotically facilitate 10 people at a time. So it's scale-free, right? So whether it's 400, 4,000, 40,000 people, it doesn't matter because it's a robot facilitator. And robot facilitators are also good because it produces real-time transcripts and also nudging people who didn't speak to speak more. And there's much more information that we can use language model to synthesize into a more co-creative whole so that we can talk to the entire city, right? So at the end of the 450 people citizen alignment assembly, we actually got much more innovative, very nuanced approaches, because while a human facilitator, if not properly trained, may over-compress and lose nuance in the citizens' reports. You see that many times. A language model preserves the nuance. And then, of course, we now see a very nuanced, very balanced approach, like requiring digital signatures before anyone enjoy the freedom of reach by advertisements, so that celebrities cannot be deepfaked. And if a platform doesn't do it, it's no fine immediately. But if somebody get conned for 1 million, that platform must be now liable for that 1 million million, and so on, right? So this is very nuanced. You cannot compress it into a headline. But that verbatim is written into our anti-fraud law legislation draft. And there's many lines like that that easily gets compressed if you use a human facilitator that's not very well trained in the domain. But machines don't lose that nuance. And so it is now in the parliamentary table. So, and all this entire process took only 2 months. And so I think we proved as a proof of concept that whatever we learned from the earlier process, like Taiwan and so on, that we can do with quite expensive process that take 3 months or 4 months, can now be done literally every weekend if we want to do it. And I think for AI-based harms, this is very important because new harms are literally coming every week. And so this kind of rapidly facilitated, augmented deliberation is important, and we have an entire chapter in the book dedicated for that.
I'll give one other example, which is I think that even among parliamentarians, it can be very helpful to have some of these advanced tools for collaboration to communicate with each other. And I'll give a couple examples that are very different. One is in Colorado, they used quadratic voting among members of the Democratic Party, which controlled the majority, to set their priorities on discretionary spending. Mm-hmm. And the Republicans ended up seeing how well that worked and using it among themselves to also propose their shadow budgets. You end up with both parties using it, and then that's a platform potentially for the whole parliament to adopt new roles. Another even more advanced example, which no one's done, but I'm very excited about, is there's this new technology of speaking the world into existence, where you can go into a virtual reality environment and then use a language model to say how you want the environment to change, and it changes. You can imagine combining that in a virtual space with a physically embodied version of Polis, where literally people move around the space to demonstrate their perspectives. And then you can have the statements that emerge as consensual be the ones that get read into the LLM to change the space. Imagine designing a bridge or a physical layout of an environment using that technology. You now have a completely different way of imagining participatory budgeting, where rather than just imposing budget constraints on people, you impose the constraints of physical space on people in a shared space, and people can literally deal with the challenges that are created by a bridge obscuring the community and therefore undermining a marginalized population. They can feel it together and decide the trade-offs that they want to make on that. So these can be used among legislators themselves to understand each other's perspective more completely.
Before the next question, you wanted to see the trailer, or should we keep it?
It's just 3 minutes. Yeah. Can you do it full screen?
Across the world, democracy is on a decline. Authoritarianism is on the rise.
Global freedom has eroded for the 18th consecutive year. What is your greatest hope for democracy across the globe?
That people see democracy as a social technology, something that people can construct together, that they can improve in the here and now. We can code up political systems.
The Sunflower Movement was a real turning point for Taiwan's democracy.
When the Sunflower Movement happened, I said to my colleague, I have to leave now, democracy needs me. I brought a very long cable for internet connection. I live streamed through Twitter. Everybody saw it is possible for democracy to evolve, to come up with novel policies simply by asking the people, what should we do together? I was born with a heart defect, and one day I just fainted. I woke up in a hospital, and they told me the hole in my heart has grown. I could die. This awareness that everything can be reset tomorrow reminds me of Taiwanese democracy. We can't lose our democracy just with a couple of missiles.
I think there's a lot that the world can learn from Taiwan. The U.S. is running on a 250-year-old operating system. There's a strong desire to move beyond this and to really rethink from first principles what would democracy in the 21st century actually look like.
We can make the government more open to the public. It'll be easier for people to access the data, to analyze it, transparency.
Audrey has created the opportunity to make Taiwan the most exciting constitutional democracy in the world.
I think it's a very critical moment. China really wants to invade Taiwan.
You're sitting on a place that is the flashpoint if there's going to be World War III. And yet there's calm in the eye of the hurricane. And that calm, I think, emanates from all that Audrey has done.
We can become co-creators of our democratic system, reconfiguring society in a way that is more transparent, more inclusive, more fair.
The reason I wanted to show this is that, as I think Audrey's life shows most clearly, this is a very intellectual conversation. It's great to have intellectual conversations, but without blood from the heart, the brain does not work. And so it's, I think, very important to speak on many registers. So.
Thank you.
Very quickly, we're going to take the 2 questions in a row. 3 questions? Okay, and then I think we're going to go towards our closing remarks. So try to keep it short, try to keep it concise. I know it's a challenge.
Hello, and thanks. And thanks, Arantxa. I was about to ask a question almost on the topic that was on the documentary. You are probably, Mr. Tang, one of the foremost experts in the Chinese propaganda and the Chinese action on social networks and the internet. What would be your first advice for us? And we talk about this here in Europe and especially in France, just a few days after a part of France have been cut from one of the Chinese networks, especially TikTok. Yeah. So what has been your observation of the evolution of China action and maybe interference in elections, not only yours, but others, US, Europe, probably. So what's your advice?
Well, there really is only one meta-narrative that the PRC regime is pushing, and it is democracy never delivers, and that's it. Yeah, and democracy only leads to chaos. Democracy can never counter the COVID. Democracy doesn't do lockdowns well, or whatever, right? So depending on the topic of the year, it takes different variations. But it's never pro any party or against any party. It's never pro a platform or against a platform. It is about amplifying the extreme parts of any platform until people feel this breaking point and people would say, oh, democracy never delivers. Democracy only leads to chaos, right? So once you know this meta-narrative, to pre-bunk it is easier than to debunk it. Because if you debunk it, you're playing a chasing game, and they get to set the agenda to chase you, right? And then you cannot really catch up to the infinite variations of agendas of the dividing points. But if you pre-bunk, that is to say, your citizens all know that they're going to say this, and they're going to say this to every topic, then it becomes possible for the civil society, not any political party, to set the agenda in a cross-cutting way that Glenn just described. One example. In Taiwan, we held fort until the Delta and the first Omicron wave through contact tracing designed by the civil society. This is unheard of. This is a very good technological achievement. But we always know that we cannot hold forever. And vaccination rate is, at the end of the day, the most important metric. And we already know, observing from other information ecosystems, that they're going to amplify the anti-vax conspiracy theory. So instead of debunking that, which actually takes a lot of investment and work. You know about this, yes?
Yeah.
Okay, we decide not to do that. We decide to pre-bunk that. So what we did is that working with civil society and the open data movement and so on, we did really cool real-time open data and visualization of the preference of each age brackets on each vaccine types. So like the 60 to 70 people, how many percent prefer AstraZeneca? Not many. And how many prefer Moderna? How many prefer BNT? And how many in the like 20 to 30? There's a segment that prefer Medigen, our home brew. But there are also people in other age bracket that swear it's poison. But we just publish this sports teams. Like the popularity contest between the four different brands. I got 4 brands just to make a case, but yes, I'm still alive, right? Yeah. So the point being that it turns the energy that is in the conflict into a my sport team is better than your sport team energy. And people still now, you can find people that swear only BNT is viable and Medigen is water or less, but they don't go to the anti-vax route. There is no anti-vax political faction, either offline or online, in the Taiwanese political system. And that is entirely, I would say, because pre-bunking works much better than debunking. If we wait until such conspiracy theories start to take shape, it will be already too late. And so 2 things, participatory horizon scanning against that meta-narrative. And once you scanned any particular division point, try to cause cross-cutting conflicts that turns this competition dynamic, which you cannot erase, into something that is pro-social. So if people believe this, all 3 other brands of vaccines are poison and they only want to get Moderna, still they get vaccinated. That is the main way the pre-bunking works.
And just to add 2 quick things on that, the plurality is the ultimate, is the meta pre-bunking of that Chinese meta-narrative, which is to say, if people come to believe that conflict is actually an opportunity for co-creation, then the notion that creating conflict or sowing division is a problem is immediately undermined.
Democracy leads to conflict, leads to co-creation. Why not?
Exactly. And instead of saying Chinese interference, we could say Chinese participation. And the answer for participation is more participation, right?
Okay, so Glenn is going very far with this. I remember Quedose, the French diplomatic corps, once did a disinfo website where people did a lot of good term of service analysis on social media platforms and so on, and because it's on GitHub. I contributed the traditional Mandarin translation, send a pull request. It actually get merged, so you can still find it in Quedose Diplomatie group FR, my personal translation. And of course, the PRC are not very happy about that. But then all we can say is you can make a pull request, right? You can also translate it into simplified Mandarin, why not?
All right, what a beautiful answer. So we only have 10 minutes left, and Glenn has been hyping up the closing remarks from Sergey, very rightfully so. So I don't want to chew on that time. I will invite all of you to first applaud this wonderful panel, and if you have any questions, Glenn and Audrey will be signing the books, so I mean, you know what to do if you want to ask your question directly.
Thank you very much, Pierre. I will be short. In addition to books, there will be a cocktail, right? So, and I know that I shouldn't be too long standing between you and cocktail. Constance mentioned I work on populism in the digital age, and we mentioned populism, especially in Europe, several times. And I think a lot of what has been said today is about how we use modern technology not to empower populism, but actually stand up to populism. And I will emphasize 2 things that were mentioned and discussed in detail today. So what is the fertile ground for populism today? It's what sometimes is called paradox of democratic leader. We want our doctors to be competent. We want our pilots to be competent. We want our politicians to be competent. right? We want our politicians to be well-educated, understand all these challenges, understand new technology, understand antitrust regulation, study in elite colleges, even economics should be known well. That means, however, that many of our politicians go through elite high schools, go to Sciences Po, go to what used to be called ENA, now it's called INSP, become politicians right away. And then the ordinary people are asking, are these people representing us? By choosing these competent, well-trained, experienced people, don't we actually lose the connection to people who govern us, right? And this is an existential challenge of today's democracy, which opens an opportunity for populist discourse, which say, these people don't represent you. I am populist. I will actually use the technology developed in Silicon Valley to propagate this message that only I can represent you. The funny part is sometimes these are the very same people who go through elite institutions in the UK or US who send this message. But anyway, this is actually the trade-off, which is very hard to resolve. And two stories which we've heard today, two specific mechanisms I would like to emphasize, make it easier to stand up to this challenge. And one is, of course, deliberative democracy, participative regulation, which is becoming scalable because of technology, as Audrey was talking about. So what is deliberative democracy about? Deliberative democracy is when you pick random people, not the elite politicians, not the parliament members who, to become parliament members, studied hard and also fundraised among rich people and became parliament members because they trained well, they worked hard, but that doesn't mean that parliament represents people. If you think about how many people in parliament have advanced degrees or even just college degrees in the US, we are talking about 95%. If we think about how many US voters have college degrees, we talk about 40%. And so this is a gap of representation, which is hard to address without using mechanisms that Audrey was talking about, or what we practice here in France since recently, citizens' assemblies, conventions, deliberative democracy. It's costly, it's hard, and the technology is making it easier. Randomly picked people cannot be rejected by voters because these are normal, random people, not people selected through elite tracks, but people who by definition are representative of the public. And the second idea is indeed plurality. When we talk about participative fact-checking, it's very important. Why? Because the traditional approach to fact-checking is to identify well-trained journalists, elite mainstream media. In France, the biggest fact-checker, it's actually one of the biggest fact-checkers in the world, is AFP. It's not the only one. We work with AFP. We're very proud. We have several research projects actually studying how AFP is doing fact-checking. But populists are saying, who are these people? Who appointed AFP to be the authority to fact-check? Why should we believe mainstream media, who by definition hate populists and who are hated by populists, why are these top-down fact-checking institutions should be telling us what is true and what is not true? And this is exactly where participative fact-checking actually helps, because citizens themselves learn how to get inoculated, learn how to be working on fact-checking themselves. See, it's not that the very fact that the false news proposed by populists are eventually being debunked by citizens participating in participative fact-checking initiatives, but that citizens themselves learn this immunity. And there is work in this literature how debunking and inoculation is actually much more effective than post-factum debunking. Now, how does that work? Here I come back to the course in economics that Glenn was talking about so much. Certain things are not supposed to work if you just read the first year textbook in economics. So if you think about Wikipedia, which is one of the most successful examples of participative fact-checking, it works despite it shouldn't. Right? Why people spend their time on writing articles in Wikipedia, why the whole foundation, which is an NGO, works so well, why we, and I see a lot of young people in the room, believe in Wikipedia much more than in professionally written, fact-checked, prepared British encyclopedia prepared by people with a lot of credentials. Well, it just works. And that actually creates optimism that people are not selfish, people are not egotistic, people want to contribute to public good. And despite the fact that in the first year economics textbook we say that people are homo economicus and care only about themselves, don't want to contribute to public good unless you pay them, we see that these things work. Now, 200 years ago, and this is a very French thing, people didn't believe that planes made of metal should fly. French invested in hot air balloons, right? The Montgolfier, which was launched in the city, actually worked, and people thought that iron stuff should not, iron is heavier than air, so it should not fly, and yet the airplanes do fly. And so in that sense, I think what we need to do, we need to prove those existence theorems. We should show that best practices work. Some of them fail, but we should try new things. Wikipedia works, fact-checking works, deliberative democracy is eventually scalable, which creates this sense for optimism. On that, I'll leave you to enjoy the cocktail, because this is, again, contributing to optimism. And thank you very much, everybody on the panel, for sharing this example.